Hello and welcome to another great Thursday here on Viking.TV with me, Anne Diamond. Sadly, at the moment, I'm back home in Blighty, where the weather is cold and wet and does nothing except to make you dream of journeys to holidays in far-off, fascinating places. I'm sure it's having the same effect on my guest today, because when he gets itchy feet, he starts making plans, constructing itineraries and researching places so that he can pack his bags, travel, and then write about it. So doing, he's made some amazing experiences for himself and for us in articles that he's produced in newspapers and magazines and books. His latest one we'll be discussing a bit later on, Blue River, Black Sea. He's a professional travel writer, particularly about Germany, but in one of his books he followed in the footsteps of the late great Agatha Christie on the Orient Express, and so travelled through some of the major hotspots of current world politics. I guess if you're a travel writer, you have to be brave and look for the awkward and difficult, as well as the luxurious and scenic. Well, let's ask him. Time to say hello to Andrew Eames, who's joining us right now from wet and chilly London. Lovely to see you. Thanks for joining me.
Hello, thanks for having me.
And it is pretty horrible, as I said, wet, chilly, nasty. Are you planning your next journey already?
It's the time of year when, there's a lot of itineraries that I'm thinking of doing, but it's not a time of year, unless you're instantly doing winter sun stuff, where I particularly want to travel right now. Actually, I've got a very elderly mum, and that's another issue, but so it does hamper travel right now.
When you're normally thinking of where you might go, where would be interesting, how much do you choose where you go, and how much is sort of commissioned by a magazine editor or a newspaper?
I usually come up with the ideas mainly because I know what I like, and I know therefore what I'm kind of good at. And if I get asked to do something that's not in my comfort zone, then there's a chance that I won't do such a good job, really. So although the ideal, the perfect world would be always being sent away and never having to come up with ideas, 95% of the time I come up with the idea and then I pitch it to somebody who I think could be interested. And if they say yay, then off we go.
And I guess if that's true, then you must sort of have a feeling, an instinct for who your readers are and what they might want to read about.
Yes, fortunately, I'm the right demographic as well for the publications I write for, which tend to be, the old-fashioned news, old-fashioned, what do they call them? Not heritage, or traditional media anyway. Yes. Times, FT, Telegraph, and the readership is generally kind of my vintage anyway. So we kind of see eye to eye. What I'm interested in, generally they're interested in as well.
Oh, me too. But the world, I suppose, of writing about travel is changing. There are so many bloggers out there now. So is your world actually changing, do you think? Is it in danger?
Yes, definitely. The opportunities for what I do are definitely shrinking because the media that I write for is struggling. All the newspaper circulations are declining very fast. And I wonder when they might become unsustainable. Okay, they're doing some stuff online, but I've never really worked out how to make writing online pay its way. If I was starting out now, maybe I would be better aware of opportunities, but I'm still quite fixated on traditional media. I like seeing things in print in the end. And so I haven't really adjusted to the new digital world. And I wouldn't know if somebody came to me and asked me, how do I get into travel writing these days? I really wouldn't know how to approach it, what to say.
And anyway, it's not quite the same as sitting in an armchair with a supplement from one of those big newspapers you've probably been talking about, and just delving through that whole idea of travel. Where could we go next? There's something cozy and warm about it. And it doesn't feel quite so cozy and warm on a laptop, does it?
No. It's a Sunday afternoon activity with a log fire, isn't it?
Yes, it really is. Very much
so. It's a real pleasure.
Many people watching right now will want to know, how do you manage? Do you get yourself there? Are you paid for? Are your trips and stays paid for by the newspaper or the magazine or by PR people for the hotel or travel company?
So it has changed a lot over the years. Years gone by, there was an expenses budget from the big publications, but these days there are no expenses paid by the main publications, by my clients. So I will have to find a way of getting there and back which doesn't negate the actual fee I get for the article. So that could be approaching a tour operator or a tourist board or a hotel company to see what they can do, to see how try and stitch together the different parts of a journey to try and make it a costless experience as much as possible. There will inevitably be some costs, but hopefully there'll be less than the revenue from the actual sale of the piece.
Yes, that's part of the challenge, I suppose. But does that also compromise what you might want to say about a place? I mean, if you're hugely disappointed about an area, even a country, would you say so? Or would that sort of go against?
Just occasionally. There have been occasions in the past where I've gone off and I've done a story and it hasn't worked out as I'd hoped, as the editor had hoped. And we have a discussion, me and the editor, about what we do about it, whether we write about it as a disappointing experience or whether actually we just hold back and don't put it in the paper. Because in general, people want to read positive things. They don't want to read negative things. There's enough negativity in the news pages of the paper rather than having negativity in the travel stuff. They want to be inspired in the travel pages. So generally, negative stuff doesn't go down too well. And I do remember I wrote a piece criticizing quite a main resort operator some years ago, and actually the repercussions were extensive. The advertising got withdrawn from the publication, etc. So it doesn't do anyone any good, really, being negative.
No. And if you really, really wanted to be, or at least have your own say, that's why you write your own books, I presume.
Absolutely, yeah. And usually I hope I'm careful enough in my planning to know that I'm going to do something that I'm going to enjoy and that's going to be good. There's a different way you can approach doing this job, and that is going on a lot of pre-organized press trips, they're called, where you go as a group of journalists to something that a tourist board or a country thinks is something they want to promote. And that you can get into trouble because you get shown a lot of hotels in a row, you get shown things that they think are interesting, but they're not necessarily what you think is interesting. So you can end up getting material that you think, what on earth am I going to make out of this? It's not really a story I want.
Well, that's an interesting word you use as well, because I've read you say before that you choose places that are going to tell you a story.
Yeah.
I mentioned following in the footsteps of Agatha Christie. I mean, obviously that would be a good story. What gave you the idea? How did it turn out?
So I was in Syria, which was, a lovely tourism destination. It's hard to imagine now, but 25 years ago, it was a great place to go because of all of its historic sites. And I was in northern town called Aleppo.
Oh, God.
Yeah, Aleppo. Lovely place. It has a wonderful souk. And stayed in a hotel called the Baron and realized that Agatha Christie had stayed there. And that just didn't compute with what I thought I knew about Agatha Christie. I saw her as the doyenne of vicarage tea parties and croquet on the lawn, very, very English. Torquay may be as exotic as she went, but to find her in Syria, that was quite a surprise. And to discover that she'd actually been in Syria many a time. And so there was the whole backstory as to why she was there, and that led me into the second part of her life, and then what happened in the first part of her life that made her suddenly reinvent herself, and all of that kind of story I thought was really interesting. And the thing that connected the two parts of her life was a rail journey that she made, or a rail plus bus journey she made from London to Baghdad. When her first marriage broke down, and she kind of went off on a big adventure and met husband number two in the archaeological digs of southern Iraq, called Mesopotamia.
Right. They met in Ur, is it called?
They met in Ur, yes.
Yeah. Which was that there was a fascinating dig going on. So this would have been late 20s, would it have been?
Yes, 1928.
Yeah, we've got a picture of on the black and white one. That's how Ur apparently looked in the 20s, and it's since been further excavated, and it was a very, very ancient city.
It was a very ancient city. Unfortunately, the Babylonians, they built out of mud, and a lot of the stuff that they built didn't survive, not like the Egyptians who have stone, and so what they have got has survived. But the Babylonians built earlier than the Egyptians, but a lot of it, unless it got covered over by sand, a lot of it got eroded away.
But that was the dig where she met husband number 2.
Yeah, Max
and
Malloy. Yeah.
that's why we have novels like, obviously, Murder on the Orient Express, and Murder on the Nile, and all of those things that were set in these rather distant places. So you found out not just about the archaeology and the travel, but about Agatha Christie too.
Absolutely, and I was terribly impressed by her because she didn't come across, in my imagination, as that kind of adventurous personality previously, and she'd basically continued to write her books on these digs. She would write in the morning, and then she would clean bits of pottery in the afternoon. She said it was a different kind of detective work.
Yeah, and that's why some of those hotels really boast that, she wrote such and such a novel here, and she wrote such and such a novel in this room. And I guess some of that is true. Yeah, that's one of those hotels on the Nile that says apparently that's where she wrote Murder on the Nile or something like that. They were all called something like that, weren't they?
Death on the Nile. Yeah.
And rooms that she stayed. Death on the Nile. That's right. Yes. Yeah. What was the Orient Express like when you went on it?
So it's the one that now goes between London or Paris and Venice. So it doesn't go all the way to Istanbul. It used to go once a year all the way to Istanbul, and unfortunately that has now stopped. But it's still a lavish but vintage experience. So, and I think some of the American clients are very surprised that when they book this very expensive berth, that they don't have an ensuite facility. They have to go down the corridor to the loo at the end. And that's just as it was in Murder on the Orient Express, if you remember. I don't know if
that's right. Yeah, they're all the characters are running along the corridor, aren't they?
They're running along the corridor in your kimono is part of the whole scene. So yeah, it's still heated by a coal fire down where the attendant sits. That's I thought was wonderfully authentic. But yeah, and it's a proper working train because it covers a great deal of distance in 30 hours.
But do you still dress for dinner then?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Very much part of the whole experience is sitting down in your tuxedo.
How long were you on it? How many days?
So I think it's 32 hours, is it, from London to Venice? Yeah. Yeah.
And
so it doesn't hang around. That's a long journey, and then gets on with it.
And you would you recommend it? Because I've always wanted to.
Yeah, I mean, it's the sort of thing you do for a very special birthday or a celebration, and you wouldn't do it by yourself. It's a bit weird being on it alone, I have to say, because people kind of look at you and wonder why are you there? Are you a spy? Who do you want to pick up? Or I don't know what their thoughts were.
But especially if you're writing down in a little notebook.
Yes, writing down stuff in my little notebook. Yeah, and I felt a bit visible being by myself on the Orient Express.
Yeah, quite an experience though. Where did you get this wanderlust?
It's kind of curious. I think my dad had it, but he was very limited in what he could do. So my dad came from the Channel Islands and my mum comes from the Isle of Skye. So they're both from island groups at the different ends of the country. So I guess that is kind of already a good start. But we always went for our family holidays to the Isle of Skye every year. And it was a real schlep from southern England because there were no motorways then. So it was a bit of an ordeal, and we would always go there because my cousins were going to be there.
Look, there you are.
Yeah, there we are. So that would be the car ready to go.
Yeah.
And very formal, aren't we all wearing ties? But that's kind of, I think, how people behaved in those days.
Yeah, and the roof rack on the car with everything stuffed in it.
Yeah,
love that.
Leather suitcases on the roof rack, absolutely. That's me in the middle there. And so we would go every year to the Isle of Skye. And I didn't actually set foot on a plane until I was probably 18 or 19. So it wasn't that there was lots of travels in my youth. And it really just all started off when I'd finished at university. And I thought, well, I mean, I did a thesis about Joseph Conrad, who wrote a lot about traveling around on merchant cargo boats in Asia and South America. And I just was fired up by that, and I had to go and see what he'd been writing about in Southeast Asia. And so as soon as I finished university, I was off.
That explains why I've come across those pictures of you looking very young, but looking, well, it does look like you're on some sort of a boat.
Yeah, so that's an Indonesian pinisi, and that's me on the bowsprit of it. And that was a sailing boat, the traditional cargo sailing boats of Indonesia. And they are still, one or two of them, in use. They do still have sail cargo in Indonesia, in the archipelago of Indonesia. And this was a journey that I made on that boat down through the islands of Indonesia and ended up in Australia.
Wow, that's some wonderful journey by the sound of it.
Yeah, but we had some problems. So the bowsprit that I'm sitting on in that picture actually snapped off in a storm, and it was attached to the boat by chains. So when it was rolling around in the sea next door to us, it was like being alongside a battering ram that was going to come through the hull any minute. So it was quite hairy, it must be said.
Mind you, you already knew a bit about the water because weren't you a very keen rower? Was that at university or even before?
So yeah, school and university. So yeah, kind of water has always been my happy place in a way. So I have a sort of second career even today as yeah, that's me sitting. I'm the one with the oar that the other guy, the coach, is holding.
Oh yes.
So these days I have a second career as a rowing coach on the tidal Thames actually. So I do like going out still on the water, but these days I've got a motor. Yeah, I'm in that little, we call it a tin fish.
Yes.
In a motor launch like that, shouting at people.
But you've rowed not only on the Thames, you've rowed on the Danube, haven't you?
I've rowed on the Danube, yes, but that wasn't quite the same experience. That was right at the end of the book that you showed at the beginning, Blue River, Black Sea, where I wanted to do the last bit of the Danube Delta, where it hits the Black Sea after its 2,000-mile journey all the way across the midriff of Europe. I wanted to do that last little bit of the journey under my own steam, and I found myself a little green plastic boat. They have some very nice boats. The fishermen of the Delta have some very nice boats, but they wouldn't sell me one of those. But they would sell me this plastic bathtub that I think had fallen off some passing freight ship. And they didn't know what to do with it. And so I did the last about 50 miles of the Danube in that little rowboat.
But the Danube itself is an amazing river. I didn't know until I was researching you that the Danube is it visits the most countries as a river, doesn't it?
It crosses 10 countries.
And which is the most in the world that any river does, I gather.
Oh yes, that's probably true. And it also is the only river in Europe that goes across, rather than all the others just go up and down. Oh. So it connects Western Europe with Eastern Europe. And that's kind of one of the reasons why I was so interested in following it, because I was particularly interested because of the changes along its banks from the Eastern Bloc and what had happened in the countries beyond the Iron Curtain to the people who'd lived along the banks of the Danube before and after communism disappeared.
Yes, you see a changing world if you travel the Danube, I suppose. So does it flow east to west?
Yes, west to east.
West.
It rises at Donaueschingen, which is in the foothills of the Black Forest in Germany. And then it goes all the way down through Germany into Austria, into Slovakia, into Hungary, Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and then Moldova. I'm trying to count off those countries. I think we're nearly at 10, or was that 9? Anyway, yeah, so all the way through all of those countries, and it actually, for a lot of that route, it has good riverboats on it, working on its length, as with Viking. But actually, as it gets down into the second half, it goes between huge stone in a very big valley, very deep valley, and becomes quite boring. So actually, the river cruises that stick to the Danube in the upper part are doing much the best thing. If you go all the way down to the Delta, it can be quite dull.
Did you start at the source then? Because
I started at the source.
Yeah, you've provided us with a picture of the source, which obviously they make a big fuss of now, and it does look rather beautiful.
Yeah, it's you throw your pennies into it. It's like a wishing well, really. Throw your pennies into it, have a wish. The source of the Danube. Yeah.
If we look at some more of the pictures you've sent from that sort of journey, I'm sure every one of them has a story of some sort. I mean, can you remember where that was, for instance?
Yeah, so that's in the early stages, and I did the first bit. So I traveled in different ways. So I did part of it on a bicycle, part of it on horseback, part of it as a crew member in a freight barge, and part of it hiking, and part of the last part in a rowing boat. So I did different methods of transport in different ways. And the castles you're showing now, this was one of the particular things I was doing because I was following the footsteps of a writer called Patrick Leigh Fermor, who did the journey pre-communism. and he stopped off at a lot of aristocratic castles and mansions along the river. And so I tried to do what I could do to emulate, to see what had happened to some of those families, some of the Hohenbergs and the Hohenzollerns and the Almases and the aristocrats who were along the riverbank. That's Count Hunyadi in Hungary, and he was one of the guys whose family had been sent packing by the communists, and he'd come back to reclaim his family property. And he was very helpful in me because he actually was the guy who let me have a horse so that I could ride across most of Hungary to get to the Serbian border, actually.
Oh, so you weren't just doing it on the water, you did it in various methods of transport.
So yeah, so bicycle, horseback, hiking, and quite a lot of it on the water, but not probably only half of it on the water, because as I say, I think the second part of the river beyond Budapest is quite dull. So this is the guy who he guided me across Hungary on horseback, and we had to sleep outside, although as you can see in that particular occasion we had a proper bedstead to sleep on outside. Tamas was his name, and I had a horse that was very unwilling. It would only go when his horse went.
Ah. Weren't you, I don't know whether that was it actually, on a Serbian barge at one point?
Yes, so that's the barge and that's me on the barge. And it was quite hard to get on the barge because no barge company would agree to take a writer officially. So in the end, I waited on the Hungarian-Serbian border where barges are leaving the EU and have to do paperwork to go into the non-EU destinations. And that's where I kind of collared any ship's captain coming past and said, would you mind, can I come with you? And I was very, very fortunate in that one of the ship's captains said, yeah, why not?
Is he the one who was called Attila?
Attila, yes, yeah.
Worry, but there you go. Why would they have been so nervous about taking a writer with them?
Well, I think that they were nervous about doing anything differently, really. They were worried about what I might say, because they weren't usually autonomous. They were usually working for a big company, so it was above their pay grade to agree to something like this. But the people above their pay grade could see no benefit in taking me on board their ships, so they didn't agree to it either. So it was only on the ground with individual captains that I had any hope of getting aboard one of these freight barges. And I was lucky. I was very lucky in getting aboard the Argo, it was called. It was 100 years old and very creaky. It was fine. It did the journey fine.
Didn't you also have an encounter with a bull in rural Romania? Yeah,
so that was when I was on foot and going over the Apennine Mountains going into Transylvania. Transylvania is a lovely, lovely part of Europe. Very lovely. Yeah, that's me in a younger form.
Okay. Isn't it weird how until the Berlin Wall fell and things started to change, I thought Transylvania was a made-up country, a made-up name.
It is almost mythical, really. I mean, these guys, you can see these guys milking their sheep. They were up on the tops of the hills, and they had to sleep in what looked like wooden coffins with their enclosures where the sheep were, because there are bears and wolves in those hills, and they had very fierce dogs, and they slept in coffins with sticks. And when the dogs started barking, they would come out of their wooden boxes and scare away the bears with their sticks to defend their sheep.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, this is kind of a part of Europe, but it still goes on.
Yeah. My goodness. Well, that's why you take pictures on the way as well, I expect, isn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. No, it's a very special experience, and some of Transylvanian, no, they're great. And it's a really interesting culture in Transylvania, and as you say, it has a sort of mystical name, hasn't it? But I realized the first time I went to Transylvania, I realized I knew more about Thailand than I did about Transylvania. So I thought I've got to try and get to know this a little bit better. And these villages you can see on the left there were built by German origin people who still speak German in those villages in Transylvania, because they came down many, many centuries ago to help develop the land, and they've stayed there as little pockets of German-speaking communities. And they still travel around on horse and cart and do their hay making with scythes rather than machines.
And tell me about Zalan Patak. Is that how you say it?
Zalan
Because
Patak,
you
yeah.
said it's the most inspirational place in Europe.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of an old fuddy-duddy, really, but I just love the fact that this is completely in harmony, you know, nature and humanity together. Very little in the way of machinery. And it's also where Prince Charles has a property, because he's been very enthusiastic about the whole Transylvanian ecology and the approach to ecology. So he has a property in Zalan Patak, which is basically operated as a bit of a guest house. He's also got another one in another village called Weiskirchen, or I don't know what the Romanian for it, that's the German for it. So he's got a couple of properties in Romania, in Transylvania. And this one in Zalan Patak is run as a little guest house by the local community. He's basically got local people to do it. So you only eat what they have made, what they have grown, what they have cooked, what they have brewed. They make some very interesting strong liquor. And then you go out in the fields above, which is where some of those shepherds are, and they're all covered in wildflowers. And it just seems like there's a balance between man and nature going on there. It's kind of, I just loved it.
Yeah, well, Prince Charles must have loved it like you, and probably for exactly the same reasons.
Absolutely, yeah.
Basic though. I mean, what is the food like? It's lots of sheep cheese, goat's cheese.
It's heavy, yeah.
Yeah.
It's heavy, dairy, and not much. They tend not to go for green vegetables. It's kind of root vegetables, pasta-based stuff, and a lot of meat.
Yeah.
Quite hard to be vegetarian.
Yes, I know a Romanian girl who eats a lot of meat, and I think that's her whole culture. But Germany, though, seems to be your favourite country of all, if you had to name one, because I know you run a website just about places to go and experiences to have in Germany, don't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sort of forced into it because I'm married to a German.
Ah, there you go.
Yeah, and she comes from the north of Germany, and I used to go and visit the in-laws there. And the north of Germany is very flat, and they all go home at 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and they all drink a fair amount of beer and sit in front of the TV. And I thought, God, there must be more to Germany than this. So I would escape after being polite to the family for a couple of days. I would escape and go and have a bit of more of a look round to see what Germany is all about, and found a great deal more to talk about. But I've always found it quite hard to persuade British publications to carry feature articles about German subjects. So it's been a kind of my thing, and I've made a bit of a niche out of it in the end. And so it's been good in the long run, but it was a struggle to get people to pay attention to German stories when I was starting out.
I mean, why is that just rooted in the last 100 years of conflict or something?
Yeah, still an old-fashioned prejudice. Also, when the travel editors are looking at destinations, they tend to want to have family-friendly places that have got a sunny beach, you know, where you can just flop on the shore and then go to a nice restaurant with a terrace overlooking the sea. And that Germany doesn't really have. It has really lovely lakes down in the south where you can have that similar experience. It also has some of that going on the Baltic coast on the north. And that's where, in communism times, that's where all the East German leaders used to go for their holidays. But, you know, you're only going to get to 20 or 22 degrees in the height of summer in those destinations. And these days, people are not prepared to travel for something as chilly as that, unless you're going hiking or whatever.
So much of the scenery in Germany, though, is absolutely luscious. I mean, you have to say the words Black Forest, don't you?
Absolutely.
Gorgeous places. I took some of those pictures off your website. I just wondered if you could explain them if we have a look again, because one of them is spending the night in the Würzburg Castle.
No, that's
maybe it's not. I see. I took it off your website, not knowing exactly what it was.
Oh, I think that's the castle where Martin Luther King went to ground. No, Martin Luther went to ground in East Germany. I can't remember exactly why. It must have been a festival because it's got pictures on it. I'm sorry, you caught me out there.
Oh, no worries. And if we go on to this, you were talking about there are beaches and there are beautiful places.
Yeah, so this is Baltic. This is on the Baltic coast, and it's in Binz, yeah. And it's an old-fashioned sort of 1920s resort, and this is where all the aristocrats of Berlin used to have their holiday homes. And just along from here, and the reason I was here was I was doing a story about the Nazi holiday camp that was built by Hitler that never opened, but it's the longest building in the world. It's 5 kilometers long, this building.
Along the coast, I presume, then?
Along the coast. It's about 3 or 4 kilometers to the west of that, of Binz. And it's now these days has been converted mostly into apartments, but for many, many decades, it was just crumbling away amongst the trees and a completely abandoned property. But it has been reborn. And I went there to do a piece actually for the Financial Times about its rebirth.
That is fascinating, because you can imagine you'd have to leave it a long time before you could rebirth it.
I think they had a lot of inner struggle about what on earth they were going to do with this thing, whether they should completely knock it down or whether they should try and, give it a new life.
Yeah, especially if it's a nice bit of coastline, which clearly...
Of course, it was built on the best bit of beach of the Baltic. So it was a shame if they just let it slowly deteriorate for another few decades. So at least they've brought that back into use.
And do you recommend the Raging Roland steam rail?
That was a sort of a happy addition to being in Binz. Germany this last year had a €9 ticket where you could go anywhere for a month for €9 on the railway system, which was an amazing bargain, but you couldn't go on any of the intercity services. And I went to Prora, to Binz, on one of these €9 tickets. As a freelance journalist, I had to keep my costs down. So I took the train all the way across to get to this place to do the story for the FT. And I found that included in my €9 ticket was this steam train that ran along the coast. So what a wonderful opportunity to sit behind an old steam train, going through little woodland and along the shoreline and to little mini resorts. It was lovely, I have to say, lovely. It didn't rage very much.
Well, probably very good. That's a lovely thing that probably only few travel writers would ever find out about and pass on. It's not something mainstream that you'd read in a travel mag very often. You sent us some other lovely pictures. I don't know whether you can talk us through them. I think these are ones that, there you've taken. That looks like a lovely coastline.
Okay, yeah. So this was on Father Christmas Island in Turkey. So, there are all sorts of legends and stories about the origin of Father Christmas, but he is meant to have come from this little corner of the Turkish Riviera, and he used to visit this island, the saint, and you can go up and there's a little castle on top where a princess used to live. So it was very atmospheric, and we were on a boat. I don't think it was that boat you can see down the right-hand corner, but a group of us were on one of the big traditional sailing boats that go along the Turkish coast.
Lacey, there's an example of you not being on your own. You took the family with you?
That was, yes, and that is my daughter, who's now very grown up, wearing the hat.
Do you enjoy, well, I was going to say, do you enjoy travel more with your family? I suppose it's an entirely different experience than something you've set yourself to do as work.
Yes, and I think you'd probably have to ask them whether they enjoy traveling with me as well, because I think when I'm traveling and I know that it's work related, I like to move, and keep going, and they would much prefer to take things much easier. So I was in Vietnam just before Christmas because it's the 50th anniversary of American withdrawing from the Vietnam War, and I wanted to see a lot of the destination. I was there with my wife, and my son joined us. He was living in Australia at the time, and they got really fed up because every day we were going to a new place. But I kind of, they let me do the planning, so that's how it's going to be. And yes, it can be a conflict having family there, because you have to take it at a different pace and have a different attitude towards it. And I just want to get on and do the work. As a freelancer as well, you want to get the work done in as quick as time as possible, as short as time as possible, because it's cost effective, because you're only going to get one fee, however long you take. If you do it in a day and a half, or if you do it in a week and a half, you're still going to get the same fee.
It's true. Vietnam. I've never met anyone who's been to Vietnam recently who doesn't say it's wonderful. Would you agree?
Yeah, I mean, it is a very, very welcoming place, and it's also very inexpensive at the moment. Food is very accessible. You're not going to have any issues with getting dicky belly or anything like that. It's got simple to understand transport. What's not to like? The only thing I found a little bit disappointing was the kind of temple culture, and I think that's probably because of communism. They swept away a lot of, when you go to Thailand and places like that, there's a really, really gorgeous temple culture. But in Vietnam, it has been diminished, and people don't generally go to the temple very much, and it's not a big part of daily life.
You've got pictures from other parts of the world as well. Sweden, for instance, I think is our next picture. Not quite sure what that is, except
yes.
this picture.
Yeah, no, I was traveling around on the kayak because you have a lot of small lake boating in Sweden, and I'm trying to generate an idea in Scandinavia for the next book, actually, and it will probably play a part as well in that, in moving across the lakes by in your own little kayak or self-propelled craft, anyway.
Some breathtaking.
Oh yeah, and that's is also in. I think that was in Sweden again.
And then there's another one of you on a rail track. I mean, on one of those things
yes.
on the railway.
Yeah, once more in Scandinavia. So, yeah, railways. I do have a thing about railways. I do like rail travel. And on the recent trip to Vietnam, most of our travel was on something called the Reunification Express, which is, it sounds like it's one train, but actually it's several train sets moving along the same piece of line, and you just pick it up when you want. And we did lots of overnight. We think we did 3 or 4 sleeper journeys on that train when we were in Vietnam, on something called hard sleeper, which isn't actually hard. It's just got a mattress on a hard surface, but it sounds hard.
And then finally, I've got a picture of you at a tank exhibition or something like that. A tank.
Oh no! Now we're talking about. I was in Belarus, which is not a popular destination right now.
No.
But they were trying to promote it about 3 or 4 years ago. Hard to imagine now as a tourism destination. Yeah. And you could go to these these big industrial plants where they built these huge earth-moving machines, and they were a supplier of enormous earth-moving machines to the mining industry around the world. And this just happened to be a place where one of the big earth tippers had been painted in the colors of World of Tanks, which is a Belarus game, digital game. They've been also been created in Belarus.
Yeah, I mean, you've been to some funny places as well, and I'm thinking particularly of that weird restaurant. Now, where is it? But you went to it, and it's one where the chairs move around in the restaurant.
Yes. So this is in Germany, good old Germany.
Is it?
And they've come up with this concept of merging fine dining with a sort of fairground ride. But it's a fairground ride that moves incredibly gently. So these are the chairs and tables moving without any passengers on them yet. But they go from room to room. Imagine that with people sitting on them. And they go from room to room, and each room has a different theme. So that's the undersea or the ocean room that they're just leaving. And they'd probably be going to the space room or to the Japanese room or whatever. And each room has a different theme, and you're served a different kind of cuisine appropriate to that room. So this is a kind of 2-hour experience with 8 courses in different rooms, different themes. And the cuisine is very, very good. It's very high standard. And the ride is not really like a ride. It's like these chairs take you gently from one place to the next. So you couldn't call it a ride other than in the space room, where you're not given anything to eat or drink because you would end up throwing it over your neighbor's lap because your chair moves up and down and side to side in the space room, because of course there's a meteor storm while you're in the space room, of course.
Ooh, where is it? I like the sound of that.
So this is it's outside a theme park called Europa Park. It's not part of the park, but it uses the guys' technology. They understand how to make these things work, a fairground ride work. It's outside that theme park called Europa Park. And they're trying to wheel out this concept as a sort of restaurant of the future. So not just fine dining, but also, you know, a visual experience, a sensory experience in with the fine dining. And they are hoping that it's called adrenaline, and they're hoping that it's going to be in other capital cities before long. But it's a big investment for somebody to make in a restaurant, to build all that machinery in.
Yeah, it is a bigger, yes. But adrenaline, as in a mix of adrenaline and
Eat adrenaline, yeah.
Ooh, where in Germany is it?
So it's down near Freiburg in the south.
Wow, I like the sound of that. But you've also stayed in a hotel, I don't know whether that was in Germany too, with a rotating bed.
Yeah, that was actually the hotel that I was staying in whilst doing the adrenaline story. And this is the hotel that's part of the theme park. And why on earth they want to make the bed rotate, I have no idea. I mean, it would have been more fun if it had gone a lot faster than that. That was a very gentle rotation. But yeah, you could just lie in bed and press the button and go 360 degrees around if you wanted to.
I suppose novelty sells, doesn't it?
It wasn't, and I have, as I said, for the same reason that they did the restaurant. They have the technology, they have the know-how, so why not?
Yeah, absolutely. So I wonder, you've said I should ask your family about what it's like to travel with you, but I mean, do you ever just fancy going on a beach holiday and just kicking back and doing nothing?
No,
just
not
do
really.
it.
No, it doesn't really happen. No, I mean, it may start to happen now. I'm perhaps a little less itchy-footed than I used to be, but for the time being, whenever I travel, there's going to be some work angle.
But you went to Cambridge, didn't you, or to read English?
Yeah.
So there's probably a novel inside you as well, at least, isn't there?
I have tried. I think I'm not very good at doing the characters. I have written a couple. I did write one during lockdown, and I'd written one previously. And so far, I haven't persuaded my agent that it's worth presenting to a publisher.
Well, he's playing safe and staying with you because he knows you'll write about travel. So what's on your personal travel bucket list now?
So it's still at the planning stage for a lot of newspaper stuff. I tend to do quite a lot of roundups of 10 of the best of this and the other because I know a lot of parts of the world and they can call on me to do things very quickly. But I've got a couple of, so in the coming weekend's newspapers, I've got a thing about being in the World Championships on something called a Velogemmel, which is in Switzerland. You come down the ski slope on this, what looks like a wooden bicycle, but instead of wheels, it's got little runners. So it's the only World Championships I've ever been involved in. So it was pretty scary, pretty hard on the buttocks as well. So in terms of, I've also got a book that I'm kind of brewing, I hope will be the next one, which is about dried cod. Following the footsteps of dried cod. There's a fishery, the only real sustainable cod fishery in the world, remaining one, is up in the north of Norway. And for the last 1,000 years, they've been doing the same thing. They've been catching cod at this time of year, actually, when the cod go there to breed. And they dry them on huge cathedral-like racks. They were doing this 1,000 years ago, and actually those dried cod became a staple commodity of anyone doing any travel, for example, on ships, because you could keep it forever and a day, reconstitute it, and it'd be great protein. So a lot of the explorers were kind of fueled by dried cod. And it was also really, really useful back in the day when the whole of Europe was much more religious and had fast days. And Fridays and Lent was taken very seriously, and you couldn't eat meat, but you could eat fish. But if you were deeply inland, you didn't have access to fish unless it came in the form of dried cod. So dried cod had a really big impact on the world. It still has a big impact if you go to places like Nigeria or even the Caribbean. The main national dish of Jamaica is saltfish and ackee, dried fish and ackee. And that's because actually of the slave boats that went across from West Africa, they were fed dried cod on the way over, and that's the food they took with them.
It does make you wonder as well.
Dried cod from Norway.
In your business as well, it makes you wonder with all of the recent, just in the last couple of days, complaining that there isn't enough snow in places there is usually guaranteed snow for the skiers. You do wonder how the world will change, actually, maybe with global warming as well, how destinations will change, or they'll have to think of weird restaurants in order to get us to their places, weird restaurants with moving chairs and rotating beds.
Well, we're endlessly creative as a race, aren't we? So we come up with a solution. I was talking to somebody about the snow problem just yesterday, and they were saying that some of these ski resorts that they all make snow artificially now, but they usually require it to be below freezing overnight in order to make it. But now they've got a formula that can make snow even when it's not freezing temperatures outside, but then they have to put stuff in the water, and that's probably going to have a damaging effect to the environment. So they don't really want to do it, and it doesn't sound like it'd be a particularly good plan. But if they're desperate to keep the ski resorts open, then they have to have snow.
Well, there'll always be something for you to write about then, won't
Yeah.
We've been talking for a long time. Thank you so much. But you have just made me have itchy feet myself. You just look at those pictures and think, I want to go and see those places myself, which of course we all can do, but you've got to dream first and then make the itinerary that you were talking about, and then go and discover for yourself. Andrew, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
My pleasure too.
Thank you.